Welcome to Natural Speaking, Practical Speaking, Communicative English, Presentation in English and Non-Stop Fluent Speaking in English courses conducted by British Language and IELTS Club BLC and British and American English and IELTS Teaching Training Test and Research Academy, BAETTA International Bangladesh, Kazla Motihar, Rajshahi Center. This is MA BA Honours MA in English and ELT, First Class First Rajshahi University, Professor of English and ELT, Brand Ambassador of IELTS and Int'l Bangladesh, IELTS score 8.5. This video is one natural speaking English course for the beginners, part 1, unit 1, lesson 3, formal and informal ways of greetings and addressing different levels of people in our society in the afternoon from 5 p.m. to 12 a.m. and how will you answer politely if someone greets and addresses you from 5 to 12 a.m. at night. Let's begin. বিকেল 5টা থেকে রাত 12টা পর্যন্ত আমাদের সমাজের বিভিন্ন স্তরের মানুষকে ইংরেজিতে সম্ভাষণ ও সম্বোধনের আনুষ্ঠানিক ও ঘরোয়া পদ্ধতি। If you meet your father within 5 p.m. to 12 at night, you have to say, "Good evening, Papa. Good evening, Dad. Good evening, Daddy. Good evening, Father." শুভ সন্ধ্যা বাবা। When you meet your mother, you should say, "Good evening, Mommy. Good evening, Mom. Good evening, Mom. Good evening, Mother." মা শুভ সন্ধ্যা। If you meet your brother, you can say, "Good evening, bro. Good evening, brother." When you meet your sister, you have to say, "Good evening, sister. Good evening, sister." When you meet your daughter, you have to say, "Good evening, daughter. Good evening, dad." When you meet your son, you can say, "Good evening, son. Good evening, S." If you meet your uncle, you should say, "Good evening, uncle. Good evening, uncle." When you meet your aunt, you can say, "Good evening, aunt. Good evening, auntie." If you meet your teacher within 5 p.m. to 12 at night, you have to say, "Good evening, sir. Good evening, teacher. Good evening, dear." When you meet your mistress, you should say, "Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, miss. Good evening, madam." If you meet your students, you can say, "Good evening, class. Good evening, students. Good evening, learners. Good evening, children. Good evening, boys and girls." When you meet your friend within 5 p.m. to 12 a.m., you have to say, "Good evening, friend. Good evening, F." If you meet your wife, you can say, "Good evening, darling. Good evening, dear. Good evening, my love. Good evening, my half. Good evening, my heart." When you meet your girlfriend or fiancé, you can say, "Good evening, GF. Good evening, my dear. Good evening, my beloved. Good evening, my heart. Good evening, my sweet. Good evening, my fiancé." If you meet your children, you should say, "Good evening, son. Good evening, daughter. Good evening, children. Good evening, issues." When you meet your nephew, you should say, "Good evening, nephew. Good evening, nephew." If you meet your niece, you can say, "Good evening, niece. Good evening, knee." When you meet your grandfather within 5 p.m. to 12 at night, you have to say, "Good evening, grandpa. Good evening, Grafs. Good evening, Jifa." If you meet your grandmother, you have to say, "Good evening, grandma. Good evening, Grams. Good evening, Jima. Good evening, Grammy. Good evening, grandma." When you meet your father-in-law, you should say, "Good evening, Phil. Good evening, Fala. Good evening, dad-in-law. Good evening, father-in-law." If you meet your mother-in-law, you have to say, "Good evening, Mil. Good evening, Mala. Good evening, mom-in-law. Good evening, mother-in-law. Good evening, ma-in-law." When you meet your uncle or aunt-in-law, you have to say, "Good evening, uncle. Good evening, aunt-in-law." If you meet your son-in-law, you will say, "Good evening, son-in-law. Good evening, Sil." When you meet your daughter-in-law, you will say, "Good evening, daughter-in-law. Good evening, deal." If you meet your brother-in-law, you will say, "Good evening, bra-in-law. Good evening, Bill. Good evening, brother-in-law." When you meet your sister-in-law, you have to say, "Good evening, sis-in-law, good evening, sister-in-law, good evening, Sil." If you meet your audience, you have to say, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, guys, good evening, everybody, good evening, everyone, good evening, people." Finally, if you meet your roommate or classmates, you can say, "Good evening, mates." Lesson 3.1. How will you answer politely if someone greets and addresses you within 5 p.m. to 12 at night? If someone greets you or addresses you within 5 p.m. to 12 at night, you have to answer or respond such greetings by saying "good evening" or "evening" or "have you a good evening" or "thank you" or "thanks." Be a glorious member of British Language and IELTS Club, BLC, and British and American English and IELTS Teaching, Training, Test and Research Academy, BAETTA International Bangladesh Kazlamutia Russian Center by subscribing the channel and enjoy 50% discount on our online and offline courses. Admission going on.